Hey, oops. Hey guys, it's Andrew. So I'm going to present on community ecology, Eco-evo Feedbacks, and pollination biology as the three subdisciplines that are a major part of my dissertation work. So community ecology is a really big field, so really I'm going to focus on a couple of major driving questions in community ecology. The first is community ecology writ large, coexistence. So why are there so many species in one place? And then beta diversity, or the question of why are there different species or different groups of species in different places, and what really causes those assemblages to be different in space and time. Community ecology really started in the early 1900s with a lot of observational work that focused on plant communities and why you could find the same species or many different species within the same place. So this sort of like many observational driven fields, it broke into two camps pretty early. The Clementsians saw communities as sort of like an organism that were really driven by very highly integrated species groups that interacted and allowed one another to coexist as one large whole. And so as a part of this, those communities would then develop and age towards a climax community. Henry Gleason, on the other hand, had an individualistic view of community ecology, and he saw plant species and plant individuals as individuals that just happen to have overlapping environmental tolerances with other plant species. And so these two camps sort of went at each other for about a half century with various papers describing how they could see their pattern on small scales, but real resolution to the question of how communities were organized, especially in plant communities, didn't really come until Robert Whittaker in 1966. And the difference here is that Robert Whittaker was focused on a much larger spatial scale, and he really plotted plant occurrence and species occurrence across large gradients. So these were moisture gradients along basically from the coast all the way up a mountain range, all the way up a slope into a mountain range. And what he found was basically in line with the expectations of Gleason, the idea that plant species were co-occurring in certain places because they had certain similar habitat or environmental tolerances or environmental needs. The other important thing that Robert Whittaker contributed that made his work in the 60s a milestone for community ecology is he coined the term beta diversity and was the first to really describe it as in a mathematical way. In a statistical and mathematical way. So the idea of beta diversity is the idea that species composition changes over space, and as you go farther in space or as farther in time, you see different species and more different species. So your habitats that are farther apart share fewer species than the habitats that are close together. Like in this graph, interval of transect basically is distance between, say, a quadrat. And as you move farther away from your first quadrat, you share fewer and fewer, lower and lower percentage of the species between quadrats. And so community ecology after Robert Whittaker really changed to be a field focused on describing what forces cause communities to be different, communities to be different over space or in different locations. And the research really focused on describing two sort of classes of forces. The first were deterministic and local interaction forces. So things like competition between species that co-occur, or trophic interactions like between predators and prey, and as also environmental tolerances. That sort of has to do a lot with competition and trophic interactions. And so a lot of work went into describing how and when these sort of deterministic interactions were at play in community composition and were at play in driving change in communities. But concurrently with that research, there's also a lot of research on when non-deterministic or larger scale processes were really important in driving community change. So the idea of like things like dispersal or extinction, which don't have as strong a deterministic role. It's not like species are 100, like it's when you say a species distributes a certain distance or disperses a certain distance, they don't always disperse 50 feet. And then also later on, adding into these sort of stochastic interactions or stochastic processes, community drift, or the idea that just because a species is a superior competitor doesn't mean it will always become, it will always persist longer than its co-occurring species, really came into play in 2001 with Hubble's work. And so these two sort of groups of, or two forms of community processes really sort of went at each other for a couple of decades, until Veland in 2010 described a more generalized framework for community ecology that really placed these different forces within four major classifications of speciation, which is not as important here, but or not used as an important factor as often, but drift, selection, and dispersal as very important forces that work together or in opposition to create, to allow species coexistence and cause change in community composition. And so this is sort of where community ecology is now, is a lot of work focused on describing these four forces together at the same time to understand when different forces are more important. All right, so the next subdiscipline is sort of the feedback between ecology and evolution. And the idea that ecology drives evolution is not a new concept. It was definitely baked into Darwin's Origin of Species, and it really, that, like, the idea of ecology driving evolution was really what was the main focus of evolutionary biology for the first 100 years that after Origin. But Pimentel in 1968 proposed, was the first really to propose that evolution also guides ecology. This was the first person to really formally introduce this idea. And he did so with a set of experiments where he allowed a prey species to either adapt or not adapt to the presence of a predator, and then tracked the response of the predators population dynamics to those prey populations. And what happens is, if a prey species is restricted from adapting to the presence of those predators, the predator's ecology, the populations of that predator, actually go through much more dramatic peaks and crashes than a predator who's exposed to a prey group that has been allowed to adapt to the predator's presence. And so this idea that evolution is driving the ecological dynamics of a species or of a group of species was pretty novel, and it took off in a couple of directions. The first was expansion of empirical evidence. new systems. So bringing it into plant and herbivore interactions, or for example here, this is similar work, but they tracked both they allowed both the predator and the prey populations to vary over time, and they got very similar results. And then also trying to find situations where Eco-evo feedbacks are operating in nature or in more complicated systems. The other direction that Eco-evo feedbacks have been going is in theoretical extensions to allow more complexity, or to add on new levels of organization. So, for example, Johnson and co-authors expanded the theory of Eco-evo feedbacks to both incorporate population genetic dynamics and laws of population dynamics, population genetics. So the influence of large population size of a plant species on the ability of, or on the response of arthropod communities to the adaptations of those plant species. And then also, as I implied there, also expanded this concept into community rather than pairs, and then species pair interactions. So so what happens to the insect community rather than to the one population of insect species that eats on this plant species. So this is a field that is pretty new. Obviously, it's younger than our understanding of, or in a way, it's younger than our understanding of the structure of DNA. And it's really been driven by a lot of individual system-based or small investigations on narrow questions. And it's really sort of waiting for more work to bring, like community ecology, it's waiting for more work to bring these different observations and these different empirical and theoretical tests under one umbrella, where we can really describe general trends in what happens or what responses we expect to both ecological and evolutionary forces. All right, so moving on to the last field is pollination biology, and this is really where I focus, or this is the system where I focus. So pollination biology is concerned with all sorts of things: how pollen is made, how pollen is picked up, how pollen is deposited back onto flowers, and how pollen fertilizes, or how fertilization happens. So this field is really expanded in a lot of different directions. Very recently, this is a graph. This graph is just a PubMed search, so not exhaustive, but it shows how there's sort of an exponential increase in publications as you move through time, right after sort of starting in the 2000s. So pollination biology started primarily as evolution. So those first, before the 1950s or the 1970s, was really concerned with how floral structure or floral biology drove speciation and created barriers to reproduction between species. If you guys remember, I think it was Klaus and Kekanaisi describing. That's definitely not the right paper. But we read a bit of a description of Aquilegia, which is a species that can easily, a group of species that can easily hybridize. So they're all in the same genus. You can easily hybridize them and get really cool variants, but they don't hybridize very much in nature. And that's because there's an ecological barrier, which is their pollination biology. This species is pollinated, I believe, by hummingbirds, and this species is pollinated by hummingbird moths. So pollination biology as a selective force rather than as sort of a macroevolutionary force really didn't take off until the 80s when Landon Arnold, this isn't actually, Landon Arnold 1983 isn't actually a pollination focused study. It's a theoretical description of how you would isolate the signal of directional selection. But after this paper came out, there was a rapid increase in the number of papers in pollination biology, really just describing situations where you could see directional selection on floral structures or plant traits through their pollination biology. The last place that pollination biology really went is, and this is partly, this has a lot to do with the massive expansion of pollination biology in the last couple of decades, is pollination biology as ecology, which is sort of what things influence pollination in an ecological sense. So things like pollinator abundance or diversity, the density of other flowers around your focal species, or environmental factors. And then, of course, then you can ask all the questions about what influences these factors, what causes more pollinator abundance. And all of those things have started to fall under pollination biology as a field, but really sort of have gone off in their own direction as an ecological field rather than an evolutionary field. So the thing that makes pollination biology different from the other two subdisciplines I talked about is that it's a system rather than a theory that the work is really united under. So, so when we think about pollination biology, it's really provides a tool to understand other ecological or evolutionary forces. So in this case, my research really focuses on how we can use different pollination strategies to understand the effects of community context. So how does beta diversity, or how does changing the local floral community or the local bee community really influence the success of a certain pollination strategy? And then also, how does evolutionary context or like say the evolutionary constraints on pollination strategy for an individual flower influence its success within a single environment? And then of course, these are not, as Eco-evo shows us, these are not one-way streets. The pollination strategy feeds back on community context. It really has the success of pollination to one flower really has an effect on both the pollinator community and the subsequent year's plant community. And so understanding these forces is what my dissertation is focused on. So that's my presentation, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you have cool questions, because I always need more questions. All right, thanks guys, bye.